Welcome to Becoming Virtuosa, the podcast with Dr. Susan Crockett. You are listening to bonus episode number 1 of Soul Healing Sundays, Post-Traumatic Growth, an interview with fellow certified life coach Krista St-Germain. This episode is dedicated to Hugo.
Welcome to Becoming Virtuosa, where women learn to love their lives. Do you find yourself frustrated by society's expectations? Looking for practical advice on how to discover your talents and level up your life? You found the right place. Here's your host, U.S. News top doctor, robotic surgeon, and certified life coach, Dr. Susan Crockett.
Hello, my virtuosas and my VITs, my virtuosas in training. I am so excited to be with you today. I am your host, Dr. Susan Crockett. And as always, you can call me Sue because today I'm not doctoring on you. You're not one of my patients I'm doing surgery on today. So today you're listening in on a very intimate conversation between me and my friend Krista. All right, so I wanted to say just a little bit about doing a show on Sunday. This is a little bit unusual for us. I had the opportunity to do this very special interview with Krista, and we couldn't think of a better time to do this than on Sundays. And we decided that maybe we would start calling our Sunday releases, which will be bonus episodes. We're going to call them Soul Healing Sundays. And I am super excited about this. As y'all know, I had started off the podcast with teaching, and now I'm doing more interview style, but I kind of miss the teaching, and I've heard from some of you that that you miss the teaching too. So I'm considering maybe doing a couple more of these releases on Sundays that will be more focused on teaching and special episodes. Let me know what you think. It is a gorgeous day in New Braunfels today. As always, my little dog Ollie is tucked in next to me on my chair. The sun is shining. It's bright. All is well in the world. And so why would I want to talk about this topic? The topic we're talking about today is one that's super important in life. It's called post-traumatic growth. Now, that may seem a little bit heavy for you guys. I promise you, this topic is going to be something that you will use over and over again, and it may take you through a little bit of heaviness, but I am going to share with you my experiences, and Krista is going to share with you our experiences about going through life events that seem very stressful, our trials and tribulations. And we are going to end on a really hopeful note. Like, this education about this topic is part of one of the really important things about growing and becoming into your virtuosa self, or your best version of yourself. And it's going to be a lot of fun. So I first met Krista actually as one of my coaches. And by one of my coaches, I don't mean one of the coaches that works with me at Virtuosa Coaching. She actually coaches me. I have done her program. And Krista and I are part of a very exclusive group that people don't exactly want to be members of. That is, we are both widowed moms. We've both been widowed fairly young and with children still in the house. Now, I'm a divorce widow, which is another, even smaller category. It means that my ex-husband actually passed away very suddenly, the father of my kids. So I think as we move along in our society and divorce becomes more common, that this becomes an even larger group of women. And so I'm speaking today to any of you who may have lost your husbands or your spouses, and you still are dealing with raising their children. But this lesson that we're talking about today has a much, much broader applicability to any trial or tribulation you go through. So we hear a lot about post-traumatic stress disorder, and that is certainly a real thing. I've experienced it. And this talk in no way diminishes the diagnosis or the fact that that happens. What this talk is doing, though, is giving insight into other things that can happen as a result of trauma or post-traumatic events. And man, it's just a fascinating thing to consider that maybe this is a point of growth, and it may be even necessary for our growth. So to consider that to become the best versions of ourselves, we take what life gives us, good or bad, and even when it seems quote unquote bad, it may be something that we turn into something beautiful, or it works for our benefit. So without further ado, let's get on with the interview with the podcast. Here's Krista St-Germain. Hey, Krista, how you doing?
I am amazing and so glad to be with you.
I'm so excited to have you on the podcast today, too. Thanks for agreeing to do this with me. I am so excited to talk with you about this idea about growth being able to come from when our lives are disrupted or when we have a trauma. Because so often we hear about like PTSD and see people struggling, and certainly that's real. But until recently, until I met you, actually, I didn't have that much of a concept around how growth can happen after trauma. So
Yeah,
I wanted to start by you telling me a little bit about your story.
sure.
Tell our listeners about you.
About my story. So, yeah, I came to this work after having my own grief experience. So, when I was 40, my new husband, we'd only been married 3 months. He's kind of my dream
Wow.
guy, to be honest. Had been married and had 2 children, and that marriage did not end well. And he was kind of my redemption. He was
Wow.
like
Wow.
the proof that it could be good and life was headed in the right direction.
Yeah.
And he was just everything that I wanted. Like we, had never had a fight. He was an incredible man. And he had gone with me on a trip that we were coming back from, and we'd both driven separately. And as we were coming back on the interstate, I had a flat tire in my car. So I pulled over to the shoulder of the interstate and he pulled up behind me, and being the typical stubborn man that he was, he didn't want to call AAA even though we paid for it. He just said, "No, baby, I just want to change the tire.
Uh,
And I just want to, let's get home and I can, we can talk about the weekend, cuddle and see the dog." And so against my better judgment, I acquiesced. And as he was trying to get the tire, he was standing in between his car, which was parked directly behind mine, and trying to get in my trunk to find the spare tire. There's a lot of stuff in there. And I was over on the side of the road texting my oldest to tell her that we would be late because of the flat tire. And someone out of, I just didn't hear it coming, no brakes, no anything, but slammed into the back of the Durango and trapped Hugo between his car and
oh my
mine.
goodness.
And yeah, it just happened so suddenly. And, later we found out that that man had meth and alcohol in his
Oh
system.
my
And because it
goodness.
was, daylight, hazard lights were on, but sometimes that's just not enough. Being cautious isn't enough to prevent things from happening. So,
Just that totally unexpected, that when Dale, my ex-husband, passed away too, it was a totally different circumstance, but he passed from a heart attack event when he had no prior history. He was 52, it was not an expected thing. And I think we as a family went through grief for the loss, but then also grief for how it happened so instantaneously, that traumatic. Yeah, I'm very sorry for your loss.
well, thank you. And likewise. But that is what brought me here. So, then went back to therapy. I had an amazing therapist from when I had gotten my divorce, actually, and went back and saw her. And she kind of helped me get back to that place where I was functioning well and looking to the outside world like I was strong, or so they were telling me,
Yep.
but in the inside feeling empty and really just questioning what I wanted out of life. And
Right.
being kind of realizing that what I was doing, even though it was keeping me comfortable in terms of a living, it really wasn't what I believed I was put on the planet to do. And that led me into life coaching. And then here I am.
These traumatic events, they have a way of doing that with us. Like, there is nothing that has shaken my life up and made me cherish the great things and reevaluate and question the good things, like the trauma that we've been through with this.
Yeah. It's strange, isn't it? We don't usually think, oh, trauma, that's going to be an opportunity.
No, bring it on.
But bring me some trauma. I'd really like to grow now. No, but when you're faced with it, it actually can have an upside if you want it to. Not that you have to, but for many of us, we choose that.
That's a fascinating idea, right?
Yeah.
That idea that we have the choice. Like, I remember sitting in it for a good while and wanting to just sit in it for a good while. But yeah, there came a point where I was like, I don't really want to sit in this anymore. And it almost felt guilty for that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Almost like you should. I hate that word should, but it almost felt like should. So when I found life coaching and started listening to some of your work too, one of the things that really hit me was the idea that when we have circumstances that happen to us or things that happen in our lives, that we have a choice to think, is this happening to me or for me? Which is a weird thing. But the other is that idea about handling it as a victim or a hero, right? Having those different mentalities. Can you talk a little bit about what those look like? And can you help my listeners kind of with the idea of like, it's so easy for us to feel like we're victims, like this happened to us and it was this terrible thing and something was ripped away, which it was. And this isn't to take that away. But can you talk with me a little bit about pushing the mindset towards being the hero of your life, even when this kind of trauma happens to us?
Yeah, that's one of the things that I love that you're teaching people, right? Is how powerful they are. Because that's really what this is no one would blame us for feeling like a victim. There's nothing morally bad or good about that. But it is a choice. And when we don't know that we can make it and we feel like we have to be the victim because we don't see any other option, then that's what we kind of create and get stuck in. We create more of that, we get stuck in that. And that becomes our story, is the one where things are happening to us and we end up feeling powerless. And because we feel that way, then we're really so much less able to go forward and live powerfully. And so when we can recognize that while it's not a moral issue and we don't have to be the hero, it's always our choice to figure out how we can be and to tell the story in such a way that has us as the hero, as the heroine, so that we step back into that place of power and choice and intention, and then create going forward and in the present moment from there, which again, it's not morally superior, but it's a choice.
And we're not leaving that behind. We're not leaving the event behind or discrediting that it happened or like painting daisies over it either.
Well, right. Yeah, I had been inspired by Brooke Castillo, my teacher, and hearing her tell a story one time, she told it three different ways. And she told kind of the super dramatic version where her brain was just running away with itself. And then she told a very factual version of that story where there was almost no subjectivity, it was just the facts. And then she told the same story in a way that really served her, where she, as the main character in the story, had her own back and was kind of her own champion. And so that really inspired me. And I think we can all do that when we look back at anything that's happened in our past, right? We can tell the victim story and we can find evidence, because our brain is so good at finding evidence of what we're thinking. We can find evidence of how we were wronged and how it shouldn't have happened and how we did it wrong and how we should have done it differently. And we can paint ourselves into a really miserable place. But then when we strip away all of that negative judgment, and we can also go to that place where it's just factual, where we just see what actually happened that everybody in the world would agree on.
Yep.
And when we can do that, then we have the opportunity to go to the other side of it and say, now, wait a minute. If my brain is really good at finding evidence of my thoughts, what are the thoughts I want it to find evidence of? And we can retell that story in a way that has us as the
To
heroine,
find our strength.
right? That where, yeah, where we show ourselves what it is we want to see more of, and we have our own backs. We are our own champions. And so doing that through my own loss experience was really transformative to me, because I could tell you all sorts of victim-y things that make me feel terrible and keep me small and stuck. Or I could tell you how I handled it really well and how proud of myself I am and how I grew on the other side of it. None of it would be more or less true, but one definitely serves me and is more empowering to me than the other.
And now you're helping other women
Do the same.
do the same. And what an incredible, I want to call it a ministry. I'm not sure that's the right word, but
Yeah.
what an incredible thing you're doing in helping those women. That's really cool. You know, I was really curious about one of the things you mentioned about the 5 stages of grief, because, we're taught about the 5 stages of grief in medicine, and growing up, we hear them, but you have kind of a different idea about that. Like maybe we haven't integrated it quite the way it was meant to be, or tell me a little bit more about that.
I think it's important to know that the way that the 5 stages of grief came to pass is actually, most people are familiar with a book on death and dying by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and that was one of many works that she did. But when she wrote that book, what she was studying was the process of dying, right? The process of the person who is going through the actual experience of dying in hospice. And so she didn't really ever mean for people to take her work on death and dying and apply it exactly as it was applied to grief and grieving. So then later, she and another associate, David Kessler, wrote another book called On Grief and Grieving. Similar stages, but unfortunately, how people misinterpret them is that we seem to think that one, they're linear. So we seem to think that we're supposed to go through, we're supposed to feel anger, and then we're supposed to be in denial, and then we're supposed to
Right.
bargain, and then we must experience some depression, and then finally, and only then do we get to come to acceptance. And that's not how grief works at all, right?
Yeah. Right.
And it's really frustrating when you're the griever and you're trying to measure your progress with a
Right.
framework that was never designed to be used for that purpose. And so, yeah, so we just want to understand that some people experience anger and some people don't, and some people experience depression and some people don't. And it's much less useful to try and compare yourself with a stage in a linear process than it is to just say, no, all of the feelings, all of the thoughts are all normal. It is our inclination to think when we're grieving that we're nuts, we're crazy, right? We think we're the only one having the thoughts and feelings that we're having, or that there's something abnormal about our experience. Chances are that's not true at all. The other thing I think that the concept of stages of grief implies is that there's some sort of destination, and when we reach it, we won't be grieving anymore. Like we think there's like a journey, therefore an end of the journey.
Yeah. Which is not true. It's just a modulation of it. It evolves.
Yeah, totally. I
Yeah.
like to think that like, we never go back to the person we were before.
No.
With any life experience, grief and loss is no different, right? With any life experience, we're always picking up pieces and weaving them into the fabric of who we are and what we're becoming. And that's like our human life experience.
That's the beauty of it. Like, yeah, so it doesn't necessarily need to be something as traumatic as a death. It could be any loss of normalcy in our lives where we could experience this kind of, we could grieve the loss of our job or our money or the way things were before COVID or any of these things.
And that's a really important point that you're making right there, right? Is what do we even define as grief, right? So I'm talking about it in most of the work that I do, the context is actually death.
Right,
But grief is just the natural human response to loss.
right.
So anytime we've had something normal and we perceive that we lose it, then we grieve. And that can be anything.
So that's really powerful for our listeners to hear because, one, it's kind of hard sometimes to talk about grief, but I think the work that you've done with the post-traumatic growth, you've learned it and taught it and lived it from this place of losing someone you love. But the thing I want our listeners to hear is the reason I brought you on the show to do this is because it applies to all of us. The loss of normalcy for everything that we go through is what propels us forward into either growth or stagnation. Like we can choose to sit there in that loss and be victimized, or there is a different way to think. And that is exactly what you're teaching. You're teaching how do we manage our brains around this to propel us through growth? How do we use trauma to propel us towards growth and becoming the next person that we're supposed to be, like closer to the person that we were created to be?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I also think it's worth noting, not only do we need to be clear on what we mean by grief, the natural response to loss, but we also want to be clear on trauma, because sometimes we have really tight preconceived notions of what trauma means. And really, trauma, like anything else, is subjective. It's based on human interpretation. So, what might be traumatic to me might not be traumatic to you, and
Right.
vice versa. So we don't want to confine ourselves to these strict definitions of what trauma looks like. Research says, and I think this is underestimating, that 75% of humans have some sort of traumatic life experience. Well, that's a lot. It's a lot of people. So I think it's really fair to say we all are going to have something that we interpret as traumatic.
Yep.
And therefore, we all are going to be faced with the opportunity to decide what we want to do when that happens and who we want to become because it happened.
Do we want to just have resignation and stay stuck? Right. Okay.
Exactly.
This is the new normal.
Ugh.
Ugh.
It's like fingernails on a chalkboard
This is the new
for me.
normal.
I can't stand it. Here's my thing with a new normal. I think we can use it in a way that's really helpful, and I think we can use it in a way that's really limiting. So if when you say the term new normal, you feel hopeful, you say it as though, okay, my old normal is no longer possible, but I can learn to love my new normal. I can choose to love my new normal. I can find value going forward, even though it's not the old normal. This is just a new normal. And you say it and it feels hopeful and optimistic. I like that very much. And I think that's helpful. But what I see so much in my work is that people kind of hide behind this idea of new normal, and they say it in this resigned, sad way, as if to say, nothing better for me could possibly exist. So I'll just get used to my new normal.
This is just it. This is my new box.
This is it. It's just meh from here on out.
Yeah.
Right. It's never going to be good. And what post-traumatic growth says is that that's just not true at all. Right.
So
we always have the choice.
So yeah, this is so interesting. So I was listening to an audiobook actually in my car today, Glennon Doyle's book called Untamed, which is
gotta listen. Everybody's saying
talking about it, because so much of what she's talking about has to do with this process of growth and transformation, being true to that deep, that deep light, that soul that's within our soul, whether you're working towards whatever your religious or spiritual beliefs are. She talks about becoming closer by going into your soul and becoming closer to what you're created to be. And that's so much of what we're talking about here. In this case, I hear you talking about using traumas and deciding how we're going to think about that to grow deeper into ourselves or more into ourselves. And she makes a point, she talks about it, and she doesn't talk about it in terms that we do, like the thoughts, feelings, actions model kind of thing. But she makes the point that one of the big keys to getting unstuck is your imagination.
Yeah.
She's like, that's where it starts. And I thought that's exactly what we are taught and that we are teaching when we're talking about coaching. It starts with a thought. And if you sit there and you just resign yourself to your box and you look around and you numb yourself with whatever's available, then you're doing the opposite of that. And the way out of it, as she describes it, and I thought it was just really brilliant, was imagination. Imagine what your best version of your life would be, or the best, happiest story that you could tell about your marriage or your kids. Or she was really talking about create your result for your intentional model that you want to do, right?
Yeah, I can't wait to read this book. You've got me excited. So what I think is so interesting about it when you say imagination, so we're always using it, right? And I think we don't always know that we're using it. We think we're just making observations. And so the way that I see this come to pass with a lot of my clients and in the work I've done on myself is we believe this idea that we don't know, right? We believe that we don't know where we're going.
Right.
But really what's happening is that we're imagining that we don't know.
Oh, yeah, that's right on. That's it.
Right? But we can't see it because we just think that we just literally don't know. We just think we're making an observation. But really, we're always using our imagination. But are we imagining that we do know, or we're imagining that we don't? We're imagining that we have to resign ourselves to something we don't want, or we're, figuring out how to imagine the possibilities of what we could want.
Exactly.
But it's the same power.
Like, we have all the power.
Yeah, it's the same power, right? But she's using it. I think she's teaching it in the context that imagination is good, but it can also be, we can really limit ourselves by our imagination. But everything, we're interpreting, what has happened, what hasn't happened, what will happen, it's all our imagination.
Right. That's a good point.
So it's like, what kind of imagination?
Yeah. That's a really good point. All right, Krista, this has been really fun. If we're going to say, what is the big take-home point here that you want our listeners to get out of us talking today?
Yeah.
What would you want to?
The big take-home point for me, I think, is when you can recognize the difference between the things that happen to you and your ability to decide who you want to be when they happen, like the rest of life gets so much easier. When you can keep yourself in that powerful place where you're focused on what you can control, then the sky is the limit. And it doesn't matter what's happened to you in the past. Big trauma, big T trauma, little T trauma, whatever. You can always be in your center of creation and intention and power and create the life that you want.
Wait, say that one more time. That was so good.
I don't even know what I said.
You can always be in the center.
You can always be in that your center of power, right? Because all of your energy is focused on the parts of life that are yours to control, your thoughts,
Yep.
how you feel, how you show up, right? And you aren't spinning your wheels focusing on what has happened that you can't control, other people doing things that you can't control, the future that you can't yet control. You're in the present moment and you're keenly aware of what you can control, which is what makes you so powerful and what enables you to create not only now, but to create the future that you want, which is literally only limited by your imagination.
Amazing. Brilliant. Krista, I so enjoyed talking with you today. This was so much fun. I hope you come back another time and do another
I would
one.
love it, Sue. Would absolutely love it. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Bye. Wasn't that awesome? The idea that growth can come from trials and tribulations. In fact, maybe it only comes through trials or tribulations. No, I don't think so, because if I think about my time as a musician, I practiced and grew through diligence and practice and a more deliberate way of growth. But certainly, trials and tribulations can be an accelerator for personal growth and for becoming the next version of our virtuoso selves much faster than if we were going along in the smaller, deliberate way. So I really want to thank Krista for talking with us today. I let her choose what we're listening to and what we're reading this week. So the song that she's been listening to is called Getting Good by Lauren Elena. And just a beautiful song about being at peace and being good, like right now, where we are now. Like we don't have to wait for it to get good. It can be good now, even in the midst of our trials and tribulations. And then the book that she chose is about the new psychology of post-traumatic growth. It's called What Doesn't Kill Us, the New Psychology of Post-Traumatic Growth. It's by Stephen Joseph. And this is a really incredible book. This is the science behind this new idea of post-traumatic growth. Also, if you're interested in working with Krista, or you know somebody who may benefit from working with her, like I did, maybe you know somebody who is a widowed mom or struggling with their grief, you can find Krista at coachingwithkrista.com. That's Krista with a K, and we'll put the URL in the notes. And she also has a wonderful podcast called the Widowed Mom Podcast, which is available through her website at coachingwithkrista.com or on Apple Podcasts or wherever you find your podcasts. All right. So thank you so much for enjoying this bonus episode of Becoming Virtuosa. This came about because I had a one-off opportunity and I decided to release it on a Sunday. So we're calling it a bonus episode for Soul Healing Sundays. I'm actually contemplating doing more of these episodes on Sundays with teachings as I'm doing more of my interviews on my Wednesdays. I'd love to hear your feedback. If you want to write to me at sue@virtuosacoaching.com, let me know about what you like about the podcast. If you'd be interested in me doing more teaching type podcasts like I originally did on Sundays, then we might expand this out a little bit. But in the coming week, I'm going to see you on Wednesday for our regular podcast release. We've got a fabulous interview podcast, and I'll see you on Wednesday. Have a wonderful week, my virtuosos. I love you all. Love always, Sue.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Becoming Virtuosa. If you want to find out more, come check out virtuosacoaching.com. That's virtuosa with an A, coaching.com. See you next week.